What do you do when you know you have only a few minutes to capture an amazing landscape shot of the most beautiful landscape scene you have ever seen, and the light is almost going? You're in a stressful situation because you have just a few minutes to capture it. In this video, I'll tell you about my way of thinking and how I approach a scene like that, and give you a few tips and tricks of how you can have your camera settings, how you can approach the scene and make the most out of the little time you have. You have to act fast. I've been running around like a headless chicken trying to find motifs. This summer, me and Gyda and our friend Brynjar, we were in a beautiful situation in a location called Borgarfjörður Eystri in East Iceland, where we had this amazing sunset. We had just under an hour to capture something, and when you are trying to capture a photo that is worth for your portfolio even, you don't have time for video. So on location I didn't have time to talk into the camera, at least a limited time, but it's obvious that at the time I was running around like a headless chicken trying to figure out where I can find a scene. Borgarfjörður Eystri is a popular hiking area among Icelanders. I have not seen many landscape photos from there. The mountains are beautiful in the area. The colors of the mountains, they remind a little bit about Landmannalaugar. It's an old geothermal area in some locations there. And you have these amazing colors in the mountains. This means that when we were driving up the mountains on our Jeep, I had no idea how to approach the scenes. It was the first time I came there, which is great because that's what I love. Come to a location without any idea of how to approach the scene, and get in there with a fresh mind and try to do the best you can. If you're planning to go to Iceland on a photography trip, you can buy our book Photographing Iceland, a photo guide to 100 locations, on our website. It's also available as an ebook, and you can bring it with you on a trip on your phone or tablet or computer. That's one way of supporting our channel. It's fun when the light is playing with the landscapes and all the hills. The first thing I consider when I'm in a landscape mode and trying to capture a scene is finding a foreground. Often it's quite obvious what the main subject is going to be, like in this instance, a mountain, and you want a beautiful foreground. It can be almost anything, but it must be something that offers something to the image. Now, it can be a pond, it can be a rock, or some kind of a rock formation. It can be flowers, it can be any kind of vegetation, just as long as it's offering something in the foreground that leads the attention in the end to the mountain. And by doing so, adding some value to the image. If it offers leading lines, that's a plus. When I approach a foreground, I try to keep in mind the depth of field. Of course, it depends on what aperture I'm using, how close I'm to the foreground, and how far it is between the foreground and the mountain or the subject. So whether you're using f8 or f11 or f16, it depends on how much I need to be in focus, how close am I to the foreground. So when you're working with the foreground, I try to keep in mind that if a grass or a flower is very close to me, close to the lens, I consider what aperture to use. Like if it's very close, I use a smaller aperture, higher number, like f14, f16. If everything is quite far from me, I prefer to go all the way down to f8, for example. It gives you extra sharpness, and a lot of lenses are very optimal in something like f8 up to f11 in landscape photography. That's my experience. Regarding depth of field, the lens, of course, is what you have to consider first. What millimeters does it offer? I expect that we are talking about a full frame camera, and in this instance I'm using the 14-24 f2.8 Nikon lens, my favorite landscape lens of all times. I call it the moneymaker. And this means that if I'm shooting at 14 millimeters, then the lens is quite forgiving in sharpness, because I can have something very close to the lens, like a grass or a flower or a pond. It's going to be sharp, the mountain is going to be sharp, more or less everything is going to be sharp. If you are using a small aperture, something between f11 and maybe f16. I try not to go up to f22 or something like that. In extreme cases I do, but when you have a high contrast condition like we had this evening and at this sunset in Borgarfjörður Eystri, it was not an option. Why? Because that comes to another tip I'm going to talk about, and that is I'm not using a tripod. I'm taking everything handheld, and I'll tell you why. In situations like this, when I'm trying to take in the scene, I have not been there before, I prefer to start by taking everything handheld. A tripod is not necessary, but you have to keep some things in mind. The shutter speed is going to be vital for the quality of the image. Now, in a high contrast scene like we have there, you are taking a photo straight into the sun, and you can notice that if you look at the video, that if the video is looking straight at the sun, everything in the foreground becomes shadow, very dark. If you look the other way, everything is bright. So that's just because the camera sensor cannot see the details in the shadows like our eyes do. Now Gyda and our friend Brynjar are somewhere running around the hills, also chasing the light. The sun is half down the horizon over there at the mountain. I'll show you. Now the reason I am taking everything handheld, not with a tripod, in conditions like this, is that I can experiment with a lot more foregrounds. I know there are many ponds in the area, I know there are rocks and rock formations I would like to try as a foreground in the image, and look for leading lines. So that's how I think. I like to run around, hopefully not like a headless chicken, but sorry, sometimes it's just like that. But if you have a limited time, you can try more things by going handheld. A tripod slows you down. Knowing the lens you're using is very important. I know that the 14-24 lens is very forgiving in slow shutter speeds, handheld, when I'm using the in-body stabilization. Now, what I can do is go down to 1/10 of a second, 1/20th of a second, and I know that if my hands are steady, it's going to be sharp, it's going to be okay. And usually I don't go as low as 1/10, but I try to be around 1/20 of a second. This means I can stay at ISO 64, and I would recommend more or less all the time that you are in the lowest ISO setting, the camera offers, no matter what camera you're using. Taking as slow as you can, handheld, but still knowing that it's going to be sharp, and you can check if it's sharp. I program the button on the center of the dial on the back of my camera, so I can always zoom in after each image and check, is it sharp? Is it sharp in the foreground? Is the mountain sharp in the distance? The reason I try to stay in ISO 64 or similar, sometimes up to 200, is I have to be able to take up the shadows in the editing process. Now this is a high contrast situation, and by doing this, the sensor allows me to take up the shadows without making everything grainy. Now I know that if I would bracket by using a tripod, I would more or less be getting more guarantee for a quality photo. We are talking about a stressful situation there, where I have just a few minutes to run between subjects and try to capture as much as I possibly can in just a few minutes. This is why the settings are like this. ISO 64 and shutter speed something close to 1/20th of a second, considering that I'm something close to 14 millimeters on the lens. Now this means that in the editing process I have more flexibility. The sensors today and Lightroom today is capable of taking up the darkness of the shadows and keeping the colors of the image true to what I saw when I took the shot. There are limits how much you can take up the shadows, but I would recommend that in the editing process, that if you notice something grainy appearing in the shadows, just allow the shadows to be shadows. Don't flatten the image by picking everything up. It's going to make the image flat and not as characteristic as it could possibly be. Now one tip I would like to give you is also this. Memorize the scenes. Memorize the colors of the scene. Because when you start editing the photos later, maybe a few months later, it's very good to remember, how was the sky? Was it blue or was it yellow, or how was it at the time you took the shot? How was the color around the sun? And this way you can be true to yourself when you're editing. Sometimes when you are having the peak of the colors in a landscape during sunset, the colors are vibrant. The colors are very vibrant and it can be amazing, but still you would like to, at least I like to, try to keep my editing process the way that I believe the colors, they're not too much, and if they were vibrant at the time I took the photo, okay, just let the photo be vibrant. In more or less all landscape photo editing, I keep vibrancy and saturation to 0. I don't want to change it. I work more with the light, the contrast, and the shadows and the blacks of the image. And by doing so, I believe I am ending up with something closer to the reality. And of course the profile you start with for the camera is going to affect how much saturation is from the beginning in the photo. But that's why I believe trying to memorize how were the colors when you took the photo. Speaking of foregrounds, they are the basis of a good landscape photo, often in my opinion. Don't get stuck with the same foreground. As I said, we are talking about stressful situation where you have limited time. So experiment with a lot of options. Test one foreground, it's this pond. Take a shot, how you like it. And try to spend the time you have to hike the area, get familiar with the area, and calculate the time you might have left to see, okay, which foreground would I prefer to spend the rest of the beautiful light on. So don't get stuck with the first foreground you find. Take a shot, evaluate it, and move on. This way you will end up with more options in the end and possibly find something amazing. That being said, taking everything handheld to be faster and experimenting, being able to experiment with more foreground options, it means that the next time you come to the same location and the conditions are similar, maybe you would like to bring a tripod. And this time you know the foregrounds. You might have some idea what you would like to have as a foreground this time, and then you would like to bracket, you would like to use a filter or something like that. Yeah, bring a tripod. It gives you more quality in the end. But in the times of mirrorless, in the times of image stabilization in the body, now you can take a sharp photo at slow shutter speeds, handheld. Yeah, I use tripod less and less these days. When I am working with a foreground which is very close to me, like grass which is very close, you might be trying to have a grass that's very close to the lens. You want it to be sharp, you want the mountain to be sharp. The light is going down, which means that having the histogram to the right is becoming more and more difficult. The shutter speed should not be much slower than 1/20th of a second. But if you need to use f16, for example, to have everything in focus, what do? Well, I can tell you what I do. I try to stay all the time at the lowest ISO, ISO 64. But in cases like this, I go up to 200 maybe and see how the histogram works. Why? Because I would like to have the shutter speed around 120. I don't want to go slower because I don't have a tripod. And the reason is that I know from experience that if I would have the histogram in the middle, which means that, okay, that's because I'm taking it too fast, considering how the histogram is. When I take up the shadows in the editing process, everything's going to be grainy. But if I use ISO 200, for example, the histogram is more to the right when I take the shot, and it's going to be easier to work on the editing because it's not going to be as grainy. Planning videos takes a lot of energy, and it takes it away from our focus on landscape photography, which is our main living. So I can't always plan the videos as much as I would like to. But we have been taking a lot of videos this summer. We just haven't been planning them, and I can't say that there's a good structure like sometimes, but I hope you enjoy seeing something about where we have been going this summer. So I hope you got something from this. Remember, if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe to our channel, Gudmann and Gyda. We are often making videos like this. Sometimes I don't know if it's going to be about bird photography or landscape photography, but there are a lot of videos like this on our channel, so please subscribe and give it thumbs up if you like it. Thank you for watching.